A rusty livestock truck rumbles down the dusty highway, its metal sides rattling with each pothole. Inside, 23 wild Mustangs press against each other, their eyes wide with terror, their coats slick with sweat and fear. Among them stands a young bay mare, her dark mane tangled, her legs trembling from exhaustion. She doesn't know that this truck is carrying her toward a slaughter facility, but something deep in her wild heart tells her that death is waiting at the end of this journey. What happens next will forge an unbreakable bond that defies everything we understand about loyalty, memory, and the mysterious connections between humans and horses. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The mare's story begins not with rescue, but with capture. Just 48 hours earlier, she had been running free across the Nevada desert with her small band, her hooves drumming against the hard-pan earth as helicopters thundered overhead. The Bureau of Land Management roundup had scattered her family to the winds, and now she found herself crammed into this metal prison with strangers, all of them heading toward an uncertain fate. Sarah Mitchell had been driving the same route to her veterinary clinic for 15 years, but she had never seen a livestock truck broken down on the shoulder of Highway 50. Steam poured from under the hood while the driver kicked at the front tire in frustration. As she slowed her pickup truck, the sound hit her first, a chorus of distressed whinnying that made her heart clench. These weren't cattle or sheep. These were horses, and they were in trouble. She pulled over without thinking, her emergency veterinary kit already in her mind as she approached the driver. He was a weathered man in his 50s, his face creased with worry and impatience. "Radiator's blown," he called out as she approached. "Been trying to get a tow for 2 hours, but nobody wants to touch a livestock hauler." Sarah peered through the metal slats of the trailer, and her breath caught. 23 pairs of eyes stared back at her, some defiant, others glazed with exhaustion. But it was the young bay mare pressed against the far wall that captured her attention. Unlike the others, this horse wasn't just afraid, she was dying. Her breathing was labored, her legs shaking, and a deep gash along her shoulder had been bleeding for hours. "Where are you taking them?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Processing facility in Colorado," the driver replied matter-of-factly. "These are excess Mustangs from the Nevada roundup. Government contract." The word processing hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had dedicated her life to healing animals, and here were 23 magnificent creatures being hauled toward slaughter simply because they had been born wild and free. But it was the bay mare's eyes that sealed her fate, intelligent, pleading, and somehow familiar, as if they had met before in another life. "That mare is injured," Sarah said, pointing toward the back of the trailer. "She needs immediate medical attention, or she won't survive the trip." The driver shrugged. "Not my problem. I just transport them." Sarah's mind raced. She knew the laws, knew the regulations, knew that interfering with a government contract could bring serious consequences. But she also knew that she couldn't drive away and leave that mare to die. "I'm a licensed veterinarian," she said. "I can treat her injury here, stabilize her for transport. It won't cost you anything." The driver considered this, glancing at his broken-down truck. "Fine, but make it quick. Soon as I get a tow, we're rolling." Sarah retrieved her medical kit and climbed into the trailer, moving slowly and speaking in soft tones. The other horses shifted nervously, but the bay mare seemed to understand that help had arrived. She stood perfectly still as Sarah examined the shoulder wound, her dark eyes never leaving the veterinarian's face. "Easy, girl," Sarah whispered as she cleaned the gash. "I know it hurts, but I'm going to help you." The mare's injury was worse than it had appeared from outside. The gash was deep, likely from the metal panels during loading, and infection was already setting in. Without proper treatment, the wound would fester during the long journey to Colorado, and the mare would arrive dead or dying. Sarah worked quickly, cleaning the wound, applying antibiotic ointment, and wrapping it with gauze. But even as she worked, a desperate plan was forming in her mind. "How much?" she asked the driver as she climbed out of the trailer. "How much what?" "For the mare. The injured one. She's not going to make the trip anyway, and a dead horse is worth nothing to your processing plant. I'll buy her from you right now." The driver laughed. "Lady, these aren't my horses to sell. They belong to the federal government." "Then who do I call?" Something in Sarah's voice must have convinced him she was serious, because he pulled out a battered notebook and flipped through several pages. "You'd need to contact the BLM office in Carson City, but they're not going to sell to a private party. These horses are designated for removal." Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed the number, her heart pounding as she waited for someone to answer. The conversation that followed was a maze of bureaucratic red tape, transfers between departments, and long holds that seemed to stretch forever. Finally, she reached a supervisor who listened to her proposal with growing interest. "Dr. Mitchell, you're saying you want to adopt one of the Mustangs from the trailer?" the supervisor asked. "Yes, the injured bay mare. She needs immediate medical care, and I'm willing to provide it at my own expense. I have the facilities to care for her, and I understand the adoption requirements." There was a long pause. "Well, this is highly irregular, but if you're willing to pay the adoption fee and provide proper documentation, I suppose we could arrange an emergency adoption. The mare would need to be freeze-branded and registered, of course." "Of course. How much?" $125, plus transportation costs." Sarah almost laughed with relief. She had been prepared to pay thousands. "I'll take her." The paperwork took another hour, filled out on the hood of her truck while the bay mare watched from inside the trailer. The driver grew increasingly impatient, but the tow truck hadn't arrived yet, so he had little choice but to wait. Finally, the adoption was approved, and Sarah was allowed to load the mare into her own horse trailer. The moment the mare stepped out of the livestock truck, she seemed to transform. Her head came up, her ears pricked forward, and despite her injury, there was a dignity in her movement that spoke of wild places and freedom. She loaded into Sarah's trailer without resistance, as if she understood that her life had just taken a dramatic turn. "What are you going to call her?" the driver asked as he watched Sarah secure the trailer. Sarah looked at the mare one more time, taking in her intelligent eyes and proud bearing. "Spirit," she said. "Her name is Spirit." The drive to Sarah's ranch took 45 minutes, and she spent every mile thinking about what she had just done. She lived alone on 20 acres outside of Reno, with a small barn and pasture that had been empty since her last horse had died 3 years earlier. She had told herself she wasn't ready for another horse, that the heartbreak of losing Thunder had been too much. But something about Spirit had called to her in a way she couldn't explain. Spirit's recovery was slow but steady. The shoulder wound healed cleanly under Sarah's careful attention, but the mare's emotional wounds ran much deeper. She had been born wild, had never known a human's touch until the traumatic roundup, and every instinct told her to run. For the first month, she stood at the far end of the pasture, watching Sarah with wary eyes, accepting food and water but refusing any closer contact. Sarah didn't push. She had worked with traumatized animals before, and she understood that trust had to be earned, not demanded. Every morning before work and every evening when she returned, she would sit on the fence rail and talk to Spirit, telling her about her day, reading aloud from veterinary journals, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence. Gradually, the mare began to move closer, drawn by curiosity and the gentle consistency of Sarah's presence. The breakthrough came on a cold November morning when Sarah arrived to find Spirit standing near the gate, whinnying softly. It was the first sound the mare had made since her arrival, and Sarah's heart leaped with joy. "Good morning to you too, beautiful," she said, and Spirit's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice. From that day forward, their relationship deepened with each passing week. Spirit began to approach the fence when Sarah called her name, would take treats from her hand, and eventually allowed herself to be touched and groomed. But even as she learned to trust her human companion, the wildness never fully left her eyes. She was a Mustang, born free, and that heritage was written in every line of her body. Winter turned to spring, and Spirit's trust grew into something deeper, a genuine affection that surprised them both. She would nicker when Sarah's truck pulled into the driveway, would follow her around the pasture like a giant dog, and seemed to understand that this human had saved her life. But it was during a violent thunderstorm in April that their bond was truly tested. Sarah woke to the sound of splintering wood and terrified screaming. She grabbed a flashlight and ran to the barn, where she found that a massive oak tree had fallen across the pasture fence, trapping Spirit in a corner where the twisted metal and broken branches formed a deadly maze. The mare was cut and bleeding, her eyes rolling white with terror as she struggled against the debris. "Easy, Spirit," Easy, Sarah called out, but the mare was beyond hearing. Panic had taken over, and every attempt to free herself only made the situation worse. Sarah knew she had only minutes before Spirit seriously injured herself, or worse. Without hesitation, Sarah climbed over the fallen tree and into the tangled mess of metal and wood. Branches tore at her clothes and scratched her skin, but she pressed forward, talking constantly to Spirit in low, soothing tones. "I'm here, girl. I'm going to get you out. Trust me." It took 20 minutes of careful work to clear enough debris for Spirit to escape, and by the time Sarah finally led her to safety, both of them were bloodied and exhausted. But as Sarah cleaned Spirit's wounds in the barn, she realized something had changed between them. The mare stood perfectly still, her head lowered, occasionally nuzzling Sarah's shoulder as if to say thank you. The last barrier between them had fallen. From that night forward, Spirit was no longer just a rescued Mustang. She was Sarah's partner, companion, and closest friend. They developed a routine that satisfied both their needs. Long trail rides through the Nevada hills where Spirit could stretch her legs and remember her wild heritage. Quiet evenings in the pasture where they simply enjoyed each other's company, and countless hours of gentle training that respected Spirit's intelligence and independence. But their idyllic life together was not destined to last forever. 3 years after the rescue, Sarah received a job offer that would change everything. The University of California at Davis wanted her to head their new equine research program, a dream position that would allow her to make a real difference in the field of veterinary medicine. The salary was double what she made in private practice, the research opportunities were unlimited, and the position came with housing and facilities for one horse. Sarah agonized over the decision for weeks. Spirit had never been in a trailer since that first day, had never left the ranch, had never been around other horses or people. The move to California would mean leaving behind the only home Spirit had ever known, the wide-open spaces that fed her wild soul, the familiar routines that had given her security and peace. But the opportunity was too good to pass up, and Sarah convinced herself that Spirit would adapt. She was wrong. The move to Davis was traumatic for both of them. Spirit spent the 4-hour trailer ride in a state of high anxiety, arriving at their new home exhausted and disoriented. The university facilities were beautiful, a state-of-the-art barn with individual stalls, perfectly maintained pastures, and every amenity a horse could need. But to Spirit, it was a prison. The pastures were too small, surrounded by buildings and roads, and the constant noise of human activity. Other horses grazed nearby, but they were domestic animals, born and raised in captivity, and they had nothing in common with a wild Mustang. Spirit paced the fence lines, whinnying for the wide-open spaces she had lost, refusing to settle into the routines that had once brought her comfort. Sarah threw herself into her new job, hoping that time would help Spirit adjust. She hired the best trainers, consulted with animal behaviorists, tried every technique she could find to help her beloved mare adapt to their new life. But nothing worked. Spirit grew increasingly agitated, began refusing food, and developed a nervous habit of weaving back and forth in her stall. The crisis came 6 months after their arrival. Sarah returned from a late night at the lab to find Spirit's stall empty, the gates somehow opened, the mare nowhere to be found. Campus security launched an immediate search, but Spirit had vanished into the California night like the wild ghost she had always been. For 3 days, Sarah barely slept. She drove every road within 50 miles of Davis, posted flyers with Spirit's photo, contacted every animal control facility and veterinary clinic in the region. She hired a helicopter to search from the air, organized volunteer search parties, and offered a substantial reward for information leading to Spirit's return. But the mare had simply disappeared. On the 4th day, exhausted and heartbroken, Sarah finally accepted the truth. Spirit had gone home, not to the university facilities, not to the ranch in Nevada, but to the wild country where she had been born. She was a Mustang, and the call of freedom had finally proved stronger than the bonds of domestication. Sarah's colleagues tried to comfort her with logical explanations. Spirit was probably fine, they said. She was young and strong, with good survival instincts. She might even find a wild herd to join. But Sarah knew the statistics. Domestic horses rarely survived long in the wild, and Spirit had been out of her natural environment for over 3 years. The chances of her making it back to Nevada, let alone surviving on her own, were almost non-existent. The grief was overwhelming. Sarah had lost horses before, but never like this. Thunder had died peacefully in his sleep, an old horse who had lived a full life. Spirit had been in her prime, healthy and strong, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed her. She had taken a wild creature and tried to make her into something she wasn't, and in the process, she had lost the most important relationship of her life. Months passed, then years. Sarah threw herself into her research, published groundbreaking papers on equine behavior and veterinary medicine, and earned recognition as one of the leading experts in her field. But the success felt hollow without Spirit to share it with. She never got another horse, couldn't bear the thought of trying to replace what she had lost. 5 years after Spirit's disappearance, Sarah was offered a position at the University of Nevada, Reno, a chance to return home and continue her research in familiar surroundings. She accepted immediately, eager to leave California and its painful memories behind. The house she bought was only 30 miles from her old ranch, in the foothills where the desert met the mountains, where wild horses still roamed free. It was a crisp October morning when Sarah first saw them. She had been hiking one of her favorite trails, enjoying the solitude and the familiar landscape, when movement caught her eye. A small band of horses grazed in a meadow below, their coats gleaming in the morning sun. Even at a distance, she could tell they were Mustangs, their alert posture, their wild grace, the way they moved as one unit, constantly aware of their surroundings. Sarah pulled out her binoculars and focused on the group. There were 6 horses in total, a dominant stallion, 3 mares, and 2 yearling colts. But it was the lead mare that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. She was bay with a dark mane, her build and movement achingly familiar. Sarah's hands shook as she adjusted the focus, hardly daring to hope. The mare raised her head, scanning the hillside with the vigilance of a wild creature, and Sarah saw her face clearly for the first time. There was no doubt. Despite the years, despite the changes that wild living had wrought, Sarah would have recognized those intelligent dark eyes anywhere. It was Spirit, but she wasn't alone. Pressed close to her side was a young filly, perhaps 6 months old, with the same bay coloring and the same proud bearing. As Sarah watched, Spirit nuzzled the foal gently, and the little one responded by nursing briefly before bounding away to play with the other youngster in the group. Sarah sat down hard on a nearby rock, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Joy, relief, wonder, and a deep, aching love all crashed over her at once. Spirit had not only survived, she had thrived. She had found her way back to the wild, had joined or formed a family band, and had become a mother. The filly at her side was living proof that Spirit had found her place in the world, had embraced her true nature and flourished. For the next hour, Sarah watched the herd graze and play, memorizing every detail. Spirit moved with the confidence of a lead mare, alert and protective, clearly respected by the other horses. The stallion, a magnificent black with silver markings, stayed close but deferred to her judgment about the safety of their surroundings. This was Spirit's family, her chosen life, and she was exactly where she belonged. As the sun climbed higher, the herd began to move toward the tree line, preparing to rest during the heat of the day. Spirit brought up the rear, keeping her filly close, when something made her stop and look back. Her gaze swept the hillside, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, her eyes met Sarah's across the distance. Sarah held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. Did Spirit recognize her? Could she sense the presence of the human who had once saved her life? For long seconds, they simply looked at each other, woman and horse, connected by memories of trust and love and loss. Then Spirit did something that made Sarah's heart soar. She lifted her head high and whinnied, not the alarm call of a wild horse spotting danger, but the soft, welcoming sound she used to make when Sarah arrived at the ranch each morning. It was a greeting, an acknowledgement, a message that transcended species and time. Sarah stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Spirit's face. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered, the words carried away by the mountain wind. "I'm so glad you're home." Spirit whinnied once more, then turned and followed her family into the trees, her filly dancing at her side. But before she disappeared completely, she looked back one final time, and Sarah could have sworn she saw gratitude in those dark eyes. Gratitude not just for the rescue years ago, but for the freedom to choose her own path. As the herd vanished into the forest, Sarah remained on the hillside, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, of completion, of understanding. She had thought she had lost Spirit forever, had believed that their story ended in failure and heartbreak. But now she understood that their bond had never been broken. It had simply evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than she had ever imagined. Spirit had taught her the most important lesson of her career. True love sometimes means letting go. Sarah had saved Spirit's life, had given her safety and care and affection. But Spirit had given her something even more precious. The knowledge that some connections transcend ownership, that some relationships are strong enough to survive separation, and that the greatest gift you can give a wild creature is the freedom to remain wild. Over the following months, Sarah returned to the hillside many times, always hoping for another glimpse of Spirit and her family. Sometimes she was rewarded with distant sightings, watching the herd move through their territory with the timeless rhythm of wild horses. She never tried to approach them, never attempted to recapture what they had once shared. That chapter of their relationship was closed, but a new one had begun, one based on respect, distance, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that Spirit was living the life she was meant to live. Word of Sarah's sightings spread through the local community, and she soon learned that Spirit's herd had become something of a legend. Local ranchers spoke of the bay mare who led her family with unusual intelligence and caution, who seemed to understand human nature better than any wild horse should. Photographers and wildlife enthusiasts came from hundreds of miles away, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Mustang who had returned to the wild and thrived. But Spirit was too smart to be easily observed. She had learned from her time with humans, had absorbed lessons about safety and survival that served her well in her new life. She kept her family in the most remote areas, moved them frequently, and always seemed to know when strangers were near. Only Sarah, sitting quietly on her favorite hillside, was occasionally blessed with a clear view of the mare who had changed her life. The seasons turned, and Sarah watched Spirit's filly grow into a strong, confident yearling. She saw the herd expand when another mare joined them, bringing her own foal. She witnessed the natural dramas of wild horse life, the challenges from rival stallions, the careful protection of the young, the constant search for water and grass. Through it all, Spirit remained the steady center of her family's world, the wise mare whose decisions kept them safe and thriving. On a warm spring morning exactly 6 years after Spirit's disappearance from Davis, Sarah made her usual hike to the observation point. The wildflowers were in bloom, painting the meadow in brilliant colors, and she settled onto her favorite rock with a sense of peaceful anticipation. She had learned to be patient, to accept that some days the horses would be visible and others they would not. But today was different. Today, Spirit was waiting for her. The mare stood alone in the center of the meadow, her coat gleaming in the morning sun, her head held high with the pride of a wild queen. At her side stood not one, but 2 foals, the yearling Sarah had watched grow up, and a tiny new baby, probably less than a month old. The rest of the herd grazed nearby, but Spirit had positioned herself in clear view of Sarah's hillside, as if she wanted to be seen. For a moment, Sarah wondered if this was coincidence, if Spirit just happened to be in the open meadow at the same time Sarah arrived. But then the mare did something that erased all doubt. She walked directly toward the hillside, stopping at the base of the slope, and looked up at Sarah with unmistakable intention. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. Spirit was presenting her children, showing Sarah the family she had built, the life she had created. It was an offering of trust so profound that Sarah could barely comprehend it. This wild mare, who had every reason to fear and avoid humans, was sharing her most precious possessions, her babies, with the woman who had once saved her life. The yearling, curious and bold like all young horses, took a few steps toward the hillside before Spirit's gentle nicker called her back. The tiny foal stayed pressed against his mother's side, too young to understand the significance of the moment, but sensing the importance in his mother's stillness. Sarah sat motionless, hardly breathing, afraid that any movement might break the spell. For perhaps 10 minutes, they remained like that, woman and horses, separated by distance but connected by something deeper than words. Then Spirit whinnied, the same soft greeting she had used years ago, and Sarah felt her heart overflow with gratitude and love. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you for letting me see them. Thank you for trusting me with this." As if she had heard and understood, Spirit nodded once, a gesture so human-like that it sent chills down Sarah's spine. Then she turned and led her children back to the herd, her message delivered, her gift shared. Sarah remained on the hillside long after the horses had moved on, processing what had just happened. In her years of working with animals, she had witnessed many remarkable things, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of pure communication between species. Spirit had not only survived and thrived in the wild, she had remembered the human who had loved her, and she had chosen to share her joy with that human in the most meaningful way possible. The encounter changed something fundamental in Sarah's understanding of the relationship between humans and animals. She had always believed in the intelligence and emotional capacity of horses, but Spirit had shown her something even more profound: the ability of animals to forgive, to remember love even after betrayal, and to offer their own gifts in return for kindness received. As Sarah walked back down the trail that morning, she carried with her a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for years. The guilt and regret that had haunted her since Spirit's disappearance had finally been laid to rest. She understood now that their relationship had not ended in failure. It had evolved into something more beautiful and meaningful than she had ever imagined possible. Spirit had given her the ultimate gift, the knowledge that love, once truly given, never dies. It may change form, may be expressed in unexpected ways, but it endures across time and distance, and even across the boundaries between wild and domestic, human and animal. The mare who had once been headed for slaughter had not only saved herself, she had taught her rescuer the deepest truths about freedom, love, and the unbreakable bonds that connect all living things. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who loves inspiring animal stories. Together we can spread a message of compassion and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals.